Welcome to Talking Materials Handling. In each episode, you'll hear from the thought leaders who are shaping what happens inside the four walls of the distribution center. We'll cover the gamut, from automation and robots to software and the next-gen technologies that are enabling the workforce of tomorrow. This podcast is hosted by Bob Trebilcock, the executive editor of Modern Materials Handling. Remember that Bob welcomes your comments. Now, to today's episode. Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Talking Materials Handling. Reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring. How geopolitics is changing where and how you make and source materials. I'm Bob Trebilcock, and joining me today are Rosemary Coates and Tom Cook. Rosemary is the founder and executive director of the Reshoring Institute. And by the way, she's a longtime friend of Supply Chain Management Review, which I edited for years. And Tom is the managing partner of Blue Tiger International. Rosemary, Tom, welcome.
Thanks.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
the
Bob.
opportunity to chat.
Same here. Thank you, Bob. We very much appreciate it.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. We're glad to have you. First, this is one in a series of podcasts I'm recording to highlight content from Next Gen 2023, where Rosemary and Tom were presenters on this topic. Now, I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, and when I was a kid, we were told we were the second largest steel producing region in the country. And if that wasn't enough, nearby Lordstown was the site of the largest GM plant in the country. When I was a kid, manufacturing was the beating heart of the community. And then little by little, it just all went away. Youngstown Sheet and Tube, the region's biggest employer, closed a few months after I graduated from college in 1977. And little by little, the steel industry just evaporated in Youngstown. And then Lordstown closed in 2019. At that time, it employed 1,400, which is a fraction of the 25,000 plus the plant employed in its heyday, not to mention all the tier one auto suppliers that were in the Youngstown area to feed the Lordstown plant. What people in Youngstown were told was that American manufacturing just couldn't compete. So let's fast forward a little bit. Today, US manufacturing is back. And with it, we're seeing production that was shipped overseas returning to North America, the US, but also Canada and Mexico. And with all of the political turmoil in the world, there are more incentives than ever to localize production, to make where you sell and buy where you make. So that's what I'm going to explore with Rosemary and Tom. They're both experts on this. So to get us started, can each of you just tell us a little bit about your experience with this topic? Tom, I'm going to start with you, and then Rosemary, you can take it from there.
Thank you, Bob. And pleasure to be on the panel with you, Rosemary. I'm the managing director partner for Blue Tiger International. We're global supply chain management consultants. We help companies manage various aspects of their global supply chain, and we particularly focus on the areas of risk and spend and business process improvement. This backs right into this conversation about the whole concept of nearshoring, which is a big subject matter, and basically it's defined as moving manufacturing out of China and other places around the world where there's potential serious levels of risk. And as we all went through the COVID, we all know that there was a crisis in the supply chain. A lot of that had to do with the sourcing that came out of Asia, and a lot of companies made the decision to either minimize the amount of sourcing they do internationally and also move it to places which are friendlier or closer or back here to the United States. And I think that's the gist of a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
Rosemary?
Yeah, so I'm the managing director, the executive director of the Reshoring Institute. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit and nonpartisan organization focused on helping our clients to rethink their global supply chain strategies. And also, so that's 50% of our mission. We also do a heavy amount of research and publish all of that on our website at reshoringinstitute.org. And then we also have a very robust internship program where we take graduate student interns in MBA programs and Masters of Engineering programs. and we put them to work with our research, and helping our consulting projects, and we teach them about manufacturing. So they're going to become the leaders in the future. So it's kind of fun to see these rising stars. I've been in global supply chain management for 35 years, done a lot of global consulting, particularly with emphasis in China, and now helping companies rethink that strategy and potentially reestablish manufacturing in the US. And we're also helping a lot of companies establish manufacturing in Mexico now.
Rosemary, you're kind of the reformed reshoring expert, right?
Yes,
There you
that, that's
go.
exactly right. That's a great way to say it. Yes.
So, Tom, you used at least one of the buzzwords we're hearing out there when you were giving your introduction. So, the three that we hear are nearshoring, reshoring, and friendshoring. They are buzzwords. Can you explain what's the difference between them? How do you define each of those?
Well, I'll start out with actually the similarity of the three is the idea of moving where you're currently sourcing from to somewhere else. But when we look at the three that we talk about, the idea of near sourcing is moving the manufacturing and the purchasing that we do from those manufacturers closer to the United States, Canada, Mexico, um, the Caribbean islands, and so forth would be examples of that. Um, Friendshoring would be example of moving it to countries where we have a higher degree of allegiance, where we have more of a friendlier type relationship, where we're allies both politically and militarily, and so forth. So countries like that would be Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, Israel, um, Turkey, some European countries, some South American countries, and so forth would be friendshoring. And the concept of near sourcing, which reshoring, is that reshoring is where we're actually moving it back here to the United States. And obviously, that would be a preferable trend in more cases. But obviously, you have to look at a number of factors in your supply chain, or where the costs are, where there are challenges, and in making the decision which of those three you're going to use is really become the challenge that you have involved. And specifically with reshoring, bringing it back to the United States, one of the biggest challenges that companies face is trying to get the required skilled labor that you need in manufacturing and distribution. And a lot of companies can build a model that supports moving it back to the United States, but the big challenge really becomes where do we get the people in that geographic location to take on these jobs.
Oh, thank you, Tom. So Rosemary, you and I've had this conversation for a long time. As I've mentioned, you've been writing for Supply Chain Management Review. You predate me, and I went back to 2013, and I had you speak on this topic at the very first conference I put on back in 2016. So I know you've got a lot of history here. Just kind of take us back and talk a little bit about when the reshoring movement started. What was the trigger, and then how has it grown or evolved over, say, the past decade? Because this isn't new.
No, it's certainly not new. I spent the better part of 15 years helping companies offshore to China. And as you said, I'm a reformed China outsourcer. Although we still have clients that are interested in moving production to China or expanding there. But by and large, that was the thing to do in the early 2000s. It made sense economically. It was what all competitors were doing. Everybody wanted to move to China. And so, as a management consultant, I was helping and became an expert in Chinese manufacturing. And then along came the 2012 presidential election. And we had Mitt Romney and Barack Obama that were China bashing like crazy, saying, both of them saying that China, it was all China's fault, and our economy was failing because of China, and they were stealing our jobs and manipulating currency, and on and on and on, which most of that had a grain of truth to it. But at any rate, I'm starting to feel a little embarrassed about what I had been doing for 15 years. Plus, I think, there was a significant amount of job loss that I felt responsible for. And all of this resulted in putting together with my team a methodology for looking at the possibility to reshore. And a lot of clients started talking to us about the potential to reshore. I mean, I can remember having a conversation with the CEO, and he looked me in the eye and he said, is it even possible to manufacture in America anymore? And so we put together a methodology and started helping our clients think through those opportunities. So that was 2012. So we're going on 12, 15 years now that reshoring has been around. That term's been around, and over the past say 10 years or so, it slowly grew little by little. There was interest, there was talk about it at the executive level. But then the pandemic happened. And I think what happened there is that so much risk was exposed in global supply chains. I mean, people couldn't get their shipments, they couldn't get their parts. The shipping schedules were shut down. The passenger aircraft was grounded, and that represents 50% of the cargo that moves worldwide, moves as belly cargo and passenger aircraft. So when they shut down passenger aircraft, it significantly reduced the ability to move cargo out of China. I mean, these were miserable months, right? Just not only for us individually, but in global supply chains. And that really ignited the reshoring movement. So now, I think most companies have it on their board agenda. So reshoring and sustainability are the two that go hand in hand on board agendas, and they're related. So the closer you are to your customer base, you're manufacturing your customer base, the less carbon footprint you make, and so that plays into the sustainability issues. So now it's really quite a popular idea, and as the growth has been phenomenal. I mean, we have lots and lots of clients that we're helping with their projects, and we're busy as a result of that.
Hey, Rosemary, before I go to Tom again, just a quick follow up to that, because you mentioned, the election where it became an issue with both Obama and Romney. Was politics the catalyst for sort of kicking it off? Was there, maybe lesser, but an event like COVID that said, hey, maybe we really need to rethink this? And again, I'm talking, 10, 12 years ago. Or was it just that it became, the political discussion about jobs going away and what can we do?
Well, I've been in business long enough to know that it's cyclical, and popular ideas come and go. And I think part of it was the introduction of this thought process by the politicians, thinking about China and jobs that were going away as a result of that, and starting to feel a little uncomfortable about how much production was actually gone out of the American economy. So I think it was ignited by politics. And then fast forward, of course, the Trump administration started a trade war and imposed the 25% tariffs on imports from China, the aluminum and steel tariffs, the 232 tariffs on that applied to a lot of countries. But these things, I think, really triggered a rethinking of global strategies as a result of that. So, yeah, I mean, politics plays an important role. Today, politics in terms of funding of the three big acts, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act, and the Infrastructure Act, all three of those are going to, I think they haven't yet, but they're going to pump significant money into the US economy to boost manufacturing. So politics is intertwined with the ideas and how business responds.
Tom, talking about catalysts, the forced labor issue in China has been in the news. To what extent has that expedited the effort, for companies to bring manufacturing back?
So there's always been rules going back as far as the 1930s on the books with U.S. Customs about forced labor issues. and trying to protect the idea of procurement from foreign suppliers that use various types of forced labor and child labor, indentured servant labor, and things like that in their manufacturing process. And it's kind of gone along for close to 70 years, with various cycles of when they do pay attention to it, when they don't. Um, but under the Biden administration, he has kind of moved this as to the front of the area of concern by customs. And now, for the last 2 years, customs has significantly increased their concern over forced labor in general. And then Congress supported this effort through the uh, Uyghur Act, which kind of isolated this specifically to China and the indentured servants used of the Uyghur labor in the western part of that country. In fact, for the last 2 years, close to as much as $3 billion worth of merchandise has been seized by U.S. Customs as it's come through the border, where there is a concern that there was forced labor used in the manufacturing process. The big issue that's associated with this is that it becomes very difficult for the importer and the procurement team at that importer to vet out whether or not a supplier has forced labor in their supply chain, because it's not only a view of their manufacturing, but it's also of that manufacturer's sourcing of their tier one and tier two suppliers, of where their raw materials come from and where their product comes from. And one of the best examples of that is in the solar panel industry, which is a targeted industry from U.S. Customs in this area of forced labor. So while most of the manufacturing is done in the eastern part of China, where there's either none or very little forced labor, the glass manufacturing component is sand, and specifically the silicate, which comes from sand. That comes from the western part of China, where you have forced labor issues. So right now, companies that are importing solar panels from China are having a problem in bringing that through the border, because they have to proactively try to identify or reactively try to identify that forced labor is not being used in the supply chain in China on the goods leaving there into the United States. And that's a very difficult thing to prove. And all of us that are consultants and helping companies try to navigate this have come up with various ways to help mitigate this circumstance. But right now, there's no absolute proven way that's certainly 100% acceptable by customs. And that's where the dilemma takes place, because most importers want to do the right thing and act with due diligence and reasonable care, but it's not being identified that well, because it's something that customs is also going through as a new event for them to be concerned about. So there aren't standards and all kinds of absolute circumstances that we're dealing with in trying to vet this out at this point in time.
Rosemary, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Tom 100% on what he mentioned. The Uyghurs, though, are particularly singled out. Now, as Tom mentioned, we've never allowed products to be imported into the U.S. that are made with forced labor, that so prison labor, that sort of thing, anywhere in the world, not just China. And there's lots of prison labor around the world that is excluded from the U.S., but identifying those products is the difficult part. And the Uyghurs in the Zhejiang province in far western China, the Uyghurs are a Muslim community, more akin to Arabs than they are to Chinese. And they are put in concentration camps essentially to be sort of what they call re educated. And cotton is probably the biggest commodity that's produced in Zhejiang province. So, what customs has done, as Tom was mentioning, it's not just the raw materials, but the end products that are also excluded if they include products that are made in Zhejiang province or by Uyghurs. And customs is now testing things like apparel. So, like if you're going to import t shirts, for example, it can be tested in a lab for the DNA that is related to cotton that's grown in Zhejiang province. And so it's not a matter of just tracing your supply chain, which is very important all the way back to raw materials, But also now there are sophisticated measures and tests that go on in the import process into the U.S. that will exclude these products. And this is a result of I think, the general feeling that human rights are um, coming to the forefront of companies and sourcing products around the world, and should be of concern to supply chain people. Whether you're managing supply chains or you're in a procurement role, or wherever you are, thinking about who's making those products and the raw materials that go into those products has become an important aspect of your job.
I'd like to throw a question out to both of you. I'll start with Tom. Um, this comes out of a conversation I had over the years with MIT. But to follow up, and I'll use an example. For instance, Black and Decker has adopted this strategy more recently, and I wanted to see if you think this is like outdated, or are we still doing it? So what MIT was arguing was that we weren't so much reshoring as making where you sell and buying where you make, and they were imagining that if you were selling in Western Europe, you might make in Eastern Europe to sell in Western Europe because the production costs were lower in Eastern Europe, and then develop your supply chain and your sourcing in Eastern Europe. Similarly, in the U.S., you might bring things back to the U.S., but also in Mexico and Canada. But they saw this sort of global platform kind of thing. And I remember having a conversation with Black and Decker in 2021, I think it was, and Black and Decker saying, that was the strategy they were adopting. Yes, they were bringing things back to the U.S. from China, but they were also moving things into Eastern Europe and other places. And again, I'll start with Tom. Do you see that going on, or after COVID, did that sort of change that dynamic?
Um, I'm gonna defer to Rosemary to answer it
Okay.
first, and I'm gonna come in at the second. I want to think about how best to answer that question.
Okay. Sorry I'm throwing this at you, Rosemary.
Yeah, no, 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 that's fine. Yeah, I mean, we were absolutely seeing that. So, making things closer to where you're selling them is the premise of reshoring. So it's the fundamental, looking to make things closer to where they're actually being consumed. And you're right about Europe. So, Europeans are now, we at the Reshoring Institute, we are affiliated with about 20 universities in the U.S. So about 20 in the U.S. and about 20 in Europe as well. We're part of a team there that was funded by the EU, and they're going through the same process, looking for low cost manufacturing environments that they could then serve Western Europe. And those low cost environments, of course, are Poland and Czechoslovakia and some of the Balkans. Um, but it's a little risky right now, I would say. So, there's a hesitation by companies looking to manufacture there right now because of the war in Ukraine. On the U.S. side, absolutely, I would say 80% of the clients that we work with are considering Mexico. Mexico, we're right in the middle of doing a major cross-border commerce study that should be published here in the next few weeks. But we looked at all the border towns in the U.S. with Mexico, and research the cross-border commerce, what's happening, what the wages are like. So, for example, Tijuana, the minimum wage in Tijuana is about 2.25 an hour as of January this year, which is, sort of astonishing, right? And that makes the cost of a product where you have a lot of labor be really attractive to put it into Mexico. And it's a similar wage rate along the border towns with Texas and so forth. I took one of our interns down to Laredo a couple of months ago, and we looked at the trucks coming across the border. I got to say, it was astonishing. I've seen a lot of things in my life in supply chain management, and it was jaw dropping. I mean, they process 14,000 trucks per day. And I had to ask three times to make sure that was the right statistic. They said, yes, 14,000 a day, and they do that because they have a fully automated system that reads the truck license plates, facial recognition on the drivers. Preloaded information about the truck. They scan the truck to make sure there isn't any contraband in it, and this all happens in a matter of seconds as they drive through a corridor, an electronic corridor. So these kind of developments, and there's several others that I could cite too, but these kind of developments along the border give us a natural ability to leverage a low cost manufacturing environment in Mexico. And Mexico is working very hard to develop their infrastructure and to support this kind of manufacturing. So that was a long-winded answer to the question. Yes, absolutely. Our clients are considering, hopefully bringing some manufacturing back to the U.S. and as an alternative when they need a low-cost environment and cheap labor, looking at Mexico.
Tom, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just had a couple of additional thoughts. As one is, I just want to mention that we too have a big footprint in Mexico. I have engineers on site there, helping companies build into the program. But the specific program that really works is called the Maquiladora, um, and that provides a tremendous advantage to the foreign company and the Mexican company in investing in their infrastructure there to do manufacturing, and then the financial benefits for then bringing those goods into the United States. Um, the one thing I just want to mention about this whole subject matter is that when you really look at globalization and you take the larger corporations in the United States, Fortune 2000 companies in that size, in globalization, if you're thinking about export and import, how could we create a concept of trying to sell our products into foreign countries without a mutual circumstance of us buying from them? And the issue is that really a balance needs to be looked at, both politically and internationally. That you can't have a dominance of one country in the world, um, that takes over the whole world of import and export. And I think for many years, particularly from the 1930s all the way to around 1970, 1980, the United States was in a very dominant position in both import and export. But that in the last 30 years, that has shifted to China. And I think that has created a vulnerability in most companies' minds, that imbalance, not the concept of that we should be having manufacturing in China, but the balance has gone out of whack, where so much of their percentage, in some cases 100% of their manufacturing dependency, was on China. And then the vulnerability, which clearly seen through COVID and the supply chain disruption from COVID, that created a vulnerability. So I think the issue really comes into play that most companies have to look at a much more balanced approach, a much more diversified approach to how they source products around the world, because it does make sense in certain countries where they do certain types of manufacturing because they have the raw materials, they have the low cost manpower, and so forth. But on the other hand, there are certain types of products, particularly finished goods, that need to be, because of the nature of their importance to the economy, their importance to our military integrity, the importance to the integrity of the country itself, such as in medical products and in pharmaceutical products and so forth like that, that balance be shifted to either more friendly countries or the United States. And I just think that you have to have a world view, that you can't become isolated and say we're only going to export. We have to recognize that there's really the better approach is a balanced approach, not necessarily captivating all that business in any one location.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Rosemary, I'm going to take you back to 2016. I mentioned early on that you did a presentation on this topic for me at the very first conference I put on. And what I remember for that was, or the message I took away from it was, it ain't easy to leave China. So it's 8 years later. Is it still difficult to leave China? And if so, how do you handle it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a topic that is not often considered when companies are trying to reshore. They forget that there's a whole process you have to go through to leave China. So, first of all, the Chinese government doesn't want you to leave. They want to keep manufacturing in China, and so they're going to do things to make it difficult for you to leave. For example, you have to apply for a permit and to shut down manufacturing, and they can slow walk that to 18 or 24 months. Now, you could certainly lock the doors and turn off the lights and get on a plane and go home. But you would be likely banned from going back to China or ever to selling into China, and that's not the right thing to do. So most companies will apply for the permit. The other thing is when you announce in advance that you're leaving, this creates all sorts of problems. In China, and employees are on employment contracts, and that means that they have to they sign a contract and you have to pay them during that contractual period. So it might be a 1 year or 2 year contract, and if you decide to leave, you have to pay out those contracts, and that's a big surprise to a lot of companies that are leaving. But if you have contract employees, that's the law. You have to do it. So there's a big expense there. And it's not unusual to have employees sabotage the production while you've announced, we're going to shut down in 3 months, and suddenly you have quality issues and all kinds of things like that that happen. And then finally, I think tools, dies, molds, anything that you've shipped to China, even if in the contract says you own those goods, um, I've had to have a few hard conversations with CFOs saying you're going to have to write it off because there's no way you're getting that stuff out of China. So first of all, when a company thinks of any kind of tooling or any kind of molds, that kind of thing, become part of the infrastructure of the factory, and they're not going to let it go. They feel ownership over it. Even if you think in your contract that it says you own it, it's very unlikely you're going to get it back. And then, secondly, the Chinese government is not going to allow that equipment to be exported. So, what happens is you're going to end up with a manufacturer that's got your IP, they have your tools and dies and molds. They have workers that know how to make your product, and they're going to continue to make your product and compete with you in the world market under a different brand or label. So that's a really difficult thing to deal with too. So we work with our clients that want to leave China on a strategy so that you minimize that risk and exposure, and you don't announce until the last minute and sort of quietly take care of all the business of leaving before you actually take any actions, and that's really important. And because so many companies are leaving China now, especially American companies, not so much Europeans, but I would say many American companies are trying to find alternate sources and manufacturing sites. And because of that, a lot of the Chinese manufacturers have gone bankrupt. Bankruptcy is not the same in China as it is in the US. So in the US we have bankruptcy laws, you go to court, you pay a percentage to your vendors, all of that. In China, if a company goes bankrupt, they're likely to just lock the doors and that's it. They move to some other city, some other town, and you're stuck because you may have had production that's halfway finished and it's stuck in the factory or you'll never see it again. So this is an enormous risk also for those companies that are leaving China. And all these things, it's very important to be aware of that and to work with someone who's got experience in the movement out of China in order to mitigate your risk.
So, with all of that, I'm going to throw this out to both of you. And Rosemary, I'll start with you again. Um, I've decided I'm going to leave. What are the key factors I should consider if I'm going to leave and reshore, nearshore, or friendshore?
Yeah, I think the key factor is to have a clearly defined strategy. Let's take you had mentioned Black and Decker, for example. There's recently this past year, and it was well published in the press. Decided to reestablish a factory in Texas and bring manufacturing out of Tijuana, Mexico, back to their Texas factory. And they were going to fully automate it and so forth. And the project failed. And they were limping along for well over a year. And partly it failed because the automation, the machine tools that they had designed, um, didn't work as expected. That was one thing. Then COVID happened. That was another exposed risk. Then the tools that they were making required a lot of hand finishing, and the factory workers in Texas didn't have the finishing skills that they had at the factory in Tijuana. And so I think, when you take a step back, it's kind of a failure to plan. I mean, they should have been more aware of what skills were required. They should have tested and worked with the machine tool manufacturers. They should have looked at the whole picture and done a better job of planning. There's another famous example of Otis Elevator in Florence, South Carolina. They built a new factory, and we're going to bring manufacturing back. They were also in Mexico, and they built a brand new, like fully automated factory, and they sort of opened the doors and there were no workers. And it isn't because there weren't workers in the area. They had a high unemployment rate and they knew there was a good labor base there. But the workers didn't have the skills to operate the advanced machine tools that take a lot of technical and computer skills, and there just weren't those workers. So they too stumbled along. They lost $60 million and fired the CEO. Eventually they recovered, but they lost a lot of clients in the meantime. So these kind of things are very risky, and I think trying stuff on your own is a very risky idea. You really need to have help to think through the strategies and the potholes and the misfortunes that can arise during this kind of change.
Tom, what are your key factors?
Well, I think what Marianne ended with is critical is that planning is the most important aspect. You can't just make a decision because the numbers look right in a new home. The extraction process is very difficult, and you really need to seek professional help. Organizations like Marianne, consulting companies like ours, Blue Tiger International, and there are a lot of law firms and other consulting companies that have very specific and are experienced at extracting companies from various places around the world and moving their manufacturing to other countries or back here to the United States. So it's critical that you actually get guidance, and this is not something you can Google and try to figure out on your own. This is really something that you really have to create a plan and execute the plan. And I think you have to be very patient about it. You have to be extremely detailed. I think what Marianne mentioned is very true. Is that you better plan on the fact that you're going to lose all your equipment, you're going to lose your intellectual property rights, and you're going to find that you have competitors very quickly trying to make the exact same product that you were making and selling it less expensively to the same people you were selling to. So I think those are all serious concerns, but planning is really critical and the use of external support. The one thing I would like to add is that as an option, 3 years ago, we had a client that was, I'd call a mid-sized manufacturer distributor. We had helped them like almost 20 years ago move a big portion of their manufacturing to China. And then when COVID came about, they made a decision to kind of bring most of it back to the United States or nearshoring, which we actually did in Mexico and also in the United States. We diversified it between two locations, one in Ohio and the other in Mexico. Um, and the key issue in considering that is is not only the financial benefits of doing it, but also the fact that you're diversifying your sourcing portfolio. Because what we said to them was not to eliminate China, which is what their original plan was, but just to reduce your dependency. And when China realized that that was happening, um, what we ended up doing was they actually put up money and became a partner in the Mexican facility in the Maquiladora program. So the Chinese company that lost the manufacturing actually gained it back in Mexico by being a partner in the business. So they put up capital. And you also, at that same time, protected the intellectual property rights in the transaction. So there are ways of looking at it and not totally separating, but minimizing dependence and also potentially partnering with the Chinese company and using their expertise and their capital as a partner when you move out because they don't want to lose the business. If it means that they have to do manufacturing elsewhere, then that's a potential opportunity for them as well.
Hey, Tom, before I ask you about foreign trade zones, can you real quick just explain what is the Mexican Maquiladora program?
Okay, well, I can give you the high level overview. It was actually a program designed by the U.S. Administration and the Mexican administration a little over 20 years ago, and it was designed as an immigration strategy. The idea, well, how do you keep Mexicans from wanting to come into the United States? Well, the major reason they came into the United States was they were looking for employment. They were looking for the opportunity to make a responsible wage and earning. Um, so the idea was that if we could build manufacturing and jobs in Mexico, then they would be more likely willing to stay as long as those jobs were well paying and that they could make a living. So the Maquiladora program was set up to be able to do that, and in fact, it was reasonably successful at making that happen. Appreciate the fact that though the immigration problem we have comes through Mexico, it's not necessarily all Mexicans that relates to that problem. It's people from all over the world now, and particularly from Latin and South America. Um, the Maquiladora program allows a company to create a footprint, a manufacturing or an assembly facility inside a particular geographic zone along the border. And when goods get imported, such as raw materials or components to assemble or manufacture, there's no duty paid as it enters Mexico. And when those goods finally get assembled or manufactured and now come into the United States or they get moved to Canada, there's no duty obligation as well under the USMCA agreement. So it's a methodology that creates this lower landed cost in raw materials and components into Mexico and finished product into the United States or Canada. And that's at a high level. That's and oversimplified. That's really what the Maquiladora program works. And there are companies like Rosemary's and mine and others that help U.S. companies facilitate accessing maquiladoras. And right now, it's a very hot topic, has been for probably the last 10 years, and particularly through COVID. And Mexico has risen up to the occasion to respond to most of these opportunities.
Tom, one more question to you, and then I'll finish up with two questions to Rosemary. So this might be related to Maquiladora, it might be completely different, but it's kind of on the same track. How can foreign trade zones support bringing back manufacturing to the U.S.? And can you give us an example?
Sure, and they can in a huge way. So, what a foreign trade zone is, it's a physical warehousing, distribution, or manufacturing location physically located in the United States or its territories, um, but sits out economically outside of the United States. So, what it means is that as goods move into that foreign trade zone, there's no obligation to pay duties or taxes. Okay. It's only when it comes out of that facility at a later date is there an obligation to pay duties or taxes. And if those goods actually get exported, there's never an obligation to pay duties or taxes because the goods would never have entered the United States. And that's basically what the foreign trade zone is. So what a lot of companies are doing is that they'll source materials from various places around the world, parts and components, and they'll import them into the foreign trade zone. So the immediate benefit is the deferral of the duty or taxes, and then they'll either assemble something or they'll manufacture a product. And when those goods come out, that's the only time that they're obligated to pay. But you have the opportunity for what's called tariff inversion, where the duty rate for the finished product is actually less than the duty rate of the raw material or components, and therefore you lower the cost of entering the United States. And again, if the goods get exported, there's no obligation to pay. So it's a way of companies to reshore back to the United States, but still maintain control over their landed costs. The best example that I like to give, because we were involved with this company back in the early 90s, was BMW. Think about the fact that now BMW, one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, and certainly now one of the largest car manufacturers in the United States, set up a foreign trade zone manufacturing facility in the early 90s in Greer, South Carolina. So when they import tires, wheels, engines, leather goods, electronic components, and stuff like that, the duty rates can range from 4.5 to as much as 10%. They now create an automobile, which when it enters the United States is at a duty rate of 2.5%. And the cost of labor, the cost of overhead, which happens here in the United States in that foreign trade zone, is excluded from the cost. So it creates a huge amount of savings for BMW, and appreciate the fact that most of the major car companies now manufacture or assemble in those foreign trade zones because of that economic advantage.
Rosemary, last question to you.
Yep.
So, given the political and economic state of China now, what should we be aware of when dealing with Chinese suppliers? We talked a little bit about trying to get out of China, but if I'm still in China and dealing with Chinese suppliers, what do I have to look out for?
Yeah, I think in general, in dealing with manufacturing in China, is you need to be well versed in the culture and in the practices in China. I mean, over the past 25 years or so, China has become so sophisticated in terms of manufacturing. I mean, they make Lamborghinis in China. You know, it used to be the idea was it was cheap stuff that was coming cheaply into the US, but not anymore. Now it's a lot of medical equipment and things that require sophisticated manufacturing and so forth. So I think when you're dealing with Chinese suppliers, you need to be aware of the capabilities, but also of the culture. I can't tell you how many times I was in China and I'd work all day and go back to the hotel at night. I'm like having an aha moment when I realized what somebody said to me or something that happened that I didn't expect, and realized that it was because of a government involvement or something else. So, for example, um, I had a I was working on a system implementation in Beijing, and were making decisions all day long about how to implement the system to support the operations of this company. It was an automotive parts company, and so it was going along fine. The next day, I got to work, and the manager came in and he said, "Well, we're actually not going to do it that way. We're going to change it in a different way." I was dumbfounded because we had worked so hard to develop a strategy and a plan and an approach. And then later came to find out that there was a representative of the Communist Party, the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, that was on the board, or an executive in the company, and he looked over the plans and didn't like it, so he said no. But they never explain that to you. You're just dumbfounded on why certain things happen. So these kind of things are, China hands, old China hands know to watch for these kind of indicators and strategies, and understand how to approach a situation like that, and to repair it if you need to. But also, so understanding the culture and the approach, but also having an appreciation for how hardworking the Chinese are. I mean, I've been all over the world. I've never seen people work as hard as you would find in China. It's really kind of amazing. So, dealing with hard work and focus on manufacturing goods, and the desire to serve customers. I think those are important. And then finally, I would say, since the trade war was started a few years ago, the situation has changed a lot in China. We used to be welcomed with open arms as Americans because we knew how to do things and we were buying products and so forth. Not so much today. I think because of that trade war and the rhetoric surrounding the trade war and China in general, the relationship with Americans has deteriorated significantly, and we're no longer looked at as the friendly, welcoming foreigners anymore. We're kind of looked at with suspicion. As we were China bashing in the U.S., the Chinese government was American bashing in China, and have developed kind of a anti-American strategy. as a result. So, as I mentioned before, this is business and it's cyclical, and things are popular and going well for a while, and then there's a change, and that I think is what we're experiencing today.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks everyone. That's all the time we have today. This is a topic that fascinates me. I could go for like another hour, but we're not going to do that. So, a special thanks to my guests, Rosemary Coates and Tom Cook. And thank you for joining. I hope you'll be back for our next episode. And finally, be sure to go to nextgensupplychainconference.com and enter your email address for updates about NextGen 2024. We have a date, October 21 to 23, at the Chicago Athletic Association Hotel. We're planning another great event for Talking Materials Handling and Next Gen Conference. I'm Bob Trebilcock. And again, thank you, Rosemary and Tom. It was great to hear you guys.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.
Talking Materials Handling is produced by Modern Materials Handling and Peerless Media. You can find Talking Materials Handling on mmh.com, on iTunes under SC247, or just Google SC247 Podcasts. We're on all the popular podcast platforms. For more information, be sure to visit mmh.com, and we hope you'll join us again for our next episode.